The following review is an abridged review because I genuinely felt the hours of my life slipping away. This is the final station. The Final Station is a game I was very excited for. By all accounts, it should have been one of my all-time favorites if you hear the game's premise. A zombie survival horror game where you're a conductor, maintaining his train through a zombie apocalypse. That sounded very intriguing. There's all sorts of new things you could do with the survival genre with that. It all seemed perfect. The game looked gorgeous, and I was so hyped for this one. And I started the game up eagerly, anticipating that I'd be playing an excellent roguelike horror game. Instead, the Final Station is an incredibly linear, dull, unfocused 2D survival game that doesn't seem to really understand its own strengths. Like I said, this game sounds and looks like a roguelike, but instead, everything is linear and is weighed down by a heavy emphasis on a poorly told, arguably unnecessary story. Also, did you think, based on the footage you've seen, that this is a sci-fi game? Well, apparently, it is! I don't know why it is, but it is. Look, I don't want to sound mean. I realize I had high expectations for this one, but even before I get to the game's myriad problems, there's something you need to understand about this game. The Final Station is boring. It isn't even really hateable. It's just bland. There are enough elements that hold it together that it's not a hilarious misfire like Amy or Overblood, but it's also got enough wrong with it that it's not a salvageable experience like Dead Space 3 or Resident Evil 5. It's an unenviable position for any game to be in, especially a horror game where dull can be kind of a death sentence. Terrible and great are both valid options depending on what you're looking for in a horror game, but dull? You don't want to be dull. That's the worst case you could be in. As a fellow gamer and a critic, I'm telling you this now so that if you are looking for a straight up yay or nay, this one gets a nay. It's not as bad as, say, The Deer God, but that's not exactly a hard thing to do. If you want a more thorough understanding of why the game bored me to tears, keep listening. Otherwise, I hope I've saved you the $15 you almost spent on this game, and that one of my other reviews can point you to something you'd actually enjoy. Alright, still here? Are you ready to hear what all is wrong with this game and the few things it gets right? Then here we go. First, here are the good things. 1. The game looks great. The Final Station does a lot with a very small range of colors and dimensions. Its atmosphere is oppressive, its characters are distinctive, and its world is visually creative. There's some amazing animations, particularly in the background, although there are a few mid-train ride visual hitches when played at 1080p resolution. Besides that though, a solid job all around. 2. For a game this small, there's a decent amount of enemy variety. For example, you've got regular zombies, tiny ones that attack fast, riot gear zombies that have to be punched first, exploding zombies that charge at you. It's a nice mixture that helps add flavor to an otherwise fairly basic combat system. 3. No glitches, or crashes really, during my playthrough. I can say with absolute certainty that this may be one of the few games I've reviewed in the past few years without a notable glitch. So, that's nice. 4. You're encouraged to keep your passengers alive. They each can have a status effect, like slowly bleeding out, that requires either food or medicine to counteract. However, medkits are necessary for your survival in the field, so you are strongly encouraged to play it safe if you want injured passengers to survive. Alternatively, if you just want to keep yourself alive, then you have to sacrifice any rewards you would have gotten for getting them to the next town. And that's the thing. Getting each of them to the town is vitally important because each passenger has different rewards and you'll have to play triage at a few points. This is honestly the most survival-esque part of the game though, sadly, and I'll be getting to that shortly. Now, for the bad things. 1. It's very clear controls, and especially console controllers, were not a high priority. Prime example, you cannot use the D-pad for anything. Nothing at all. Even though any sane person uses the D-pad to navigate menus. I understand this game was made for PC first, and I'm reviewing the Xbox One version, and that these are indie developers, so maybe they just don't really use controllers. And you know what? That's fine. To a certain extent, I can accept that a lot more easily when the game in question was primarily made by 2 people than, say, a AAA development team like with Quantum Conundrum. That said, the lack of any ability to even see what the game's controls are on the main menu or being able to toggle sensitivity and invert analog sticks is sure to frustrate people, even more so than the game ignoring D-pad input. I had to learn how to heal, fire, throw, punch, and drop items purely by just hitting different buttons on the controller and hoping I didn't get myself killed. The game has a lengthy intro sequence that could probably teach you these mechanics with some on-screen prompts, but instead, you're expected to just hammer it out for yourself. I see this frustrating a lot of people. 2. Level design. You know what else is infuriating? Dying, not because I failed thanks to a bad decision or a slip-up skill-wise, but because certain portions of levels are just built to have an almost Super Meat Boy-esque masochism, despite being vastly more random in terms of combat mechanics than most masochistic games. I get that there need to be jump scares, since those can really get a player's heart racing, but given the minimalist pixel art aesthetic, the monsters look less terrifying and more like adorable sentient ink blobs that unfortunately try to kill you. Dying to them is incredibly easy if you don't know what you're doing, but eventually you will get a handle on things. And then you open a door and spontaneously get bum rushed by a bunch of enemies that you had no way of compensating for. Upon your death, you are immediately sent back to the last checkpoint. There's 2 problems with this. You see, the way this has been implemented makes the game both too easy and too hard. The execution makes you feel like the Final Station wants you to masterfully address every encounter, but doesn't really care if you fail. Which, for, say, a fast-paced platformer, is fine. For a survival horror game, it misses the entire point of the survival aspect. If we can just abuse checkpoints like it's Outlast, then there goes all the tension and any real need to try and become skilled at the game. Did you burn through all your resources? Well, just reload the checkpoint. Are you low on health? Well, just reload the checkpoint. Unless the checkpoint kicks in when you are in a really bad way, which will happen occasionally, but not very often, you can basically save scum the game like as if it were XCOM Enemy Unknown. It'd be one thing if, say, enemy compositions and positions changed if you went back to the last checkpoint. That make restarting have a real consequence. Instead, you just throw yourself against the meat grinder and hope for the best. However, this also means that a lot of the combat comes down to probability and luck, which isn't nearly as substantial as a combat encounter that teaches the player something and emphasizes a certain skill. This is a huge lesson to miss from masochistic games, and is arguably the whole point of their try again mentality. It's not simply you beating your head against a wall, but the game teaching you another way to get around the wall if you're willing to listen. There's no way around the wall in the Final Station. You just keep slamming your head into it until you collapse unconscious. 3. A vague, confusing story. I'm all for ambitious storytelling, and at first, the Final Station had me interested. The subplot about Big Brother censoring the outbreak and the mysterious cargo you keep having to deliver is all very intriguing. But then the game spontaneously turns into a science fiction storyline, set in an alternate world where I think aliens landed and caused a similar plague once before? If there's some endgame twist that explains it all, it didn't feel worth it to pursue through and find out what, and that's the biggest problem with the Final Station's story. It's confusing, the details you have for your working model of the game keep changing without warning, and there's not enough left after each change to keep you engaged. You basically just keep pursuing it out of just insistence to see the end. This isn't to say all the writing in of itself is bad. There's some great character dialogue and side stories at the towns you scavenge from, but often the best material has absolutely nothing to do with this master plot we're hypothetically engaged by. Sadly, most of this side material is hard to engage with, as there's usually only 1 to 2 stories per town, and you can only hear from your passengers if you're in the passenger cabin, which sometimes you can't do because the train keeps needing to be repaired in a different room. There's no reason we couldn't hear their full conversations. There's no reason they couldn't be displayed for the player to see no matter where they are, and if we did see them, maybe some of the plot would seem more logical, if not at least a little more palatable. The overarching narrative will leave you more annoyed than invested, which is a shame because the game is laser focused on it whenever it can be, while still being incredibly vague the entire time. Either be forward with your story or be incredibly vague and not put a heavy emphasis on it. These are the 2 approaches that you can take that are going to have the best outcome. What you've got here is too stuck in the middle. 4. This survival game is very easy to survive in. There is no difficulty option in the final station, so I have to assume this is the difficulty the game's developers decided was best. It is not. Unless you fire your guns at every enemy and glass window in sight, you should always have just enough ammo to get by. And the game's limited crafting system won't press you with hard choices either. The only big decision you make for the largest stretch of the game is whether you want to craft shotgun ammo first, and then pistol ammo with whatever is left, or just pistol ammo. You can also make medkits, and there's one final fourth item later in the game, but for the majority of it, you aren't hard-pressed to divide your resources. There's a reason the crafting systems in games like The Last of Us and Alien Isolation work, and also why they have limited ammo supplies. It's what makes each of them a survival game, if not necessarily horror games. Surviving is about making do with the limited supplies available, but if you play the final station competently, then it's basically just a very slow-paced 2D shooter. The game doesn't necessarily need to have severely decreased supplies available, but the game should scale to what the player is capable of to keep them properly balanced. And it doesn't. One upgrade applied to my shotgun took down the game's latest hulking enemies so fast that I never even got to learn what was unique about it. Even the train maintenance is incredibly dumbed down when it doesn't have to be. What if there were real consequences and new parts were needed if you let a piece of the train break down? Maybe depending on the part, it has an impact on the passenger stats, or your rate of travel, or both. A total breakdown could have an awesome end state, with the train being swarmed by the ink zombies as you fight them off while you run out of ammo. That would be amazing. It would be poignant, and it would be way more effective than the actual scripted story. Instead, all that happens when the single part that needs to be fixed when traveling isn't fixed is that passengers slowly, eventually run out of air, but only if you're the most inattentive conductor on the planet. 5. The UI is needlessly inconsistent. This partially comes down to the game's analog-only controls on Xbox One, but also due to the fact that the selected and unselected portions of each menu are incredibly hard to tell apart. They are barely 3 shades apart from one another, and they never just display a selection icon over more than a handful of items in one of the menus. You'll be buying what you want to sell and exiting your train menu when you want to craft a damn medkit. Come on, why does it have to be so irritating? God! It just needs reworked. 6. There's practically no soundtrack. Just like with everything else, there's no audio settings menu either, and while in theory the game has an official soundtrack, I could swear that I barely heard it outside of the title screen. Now, minimalism has its place, but even just a few vague notes every now and then to break up the silence would be nice. The sound design isn't any better. It sounds like you're punching and shooting cardboard boxes. In conclusion, it's not that the game couldn't be good. I still believe its premise will someday be made into a stellar game, but the final station is not that game. It's got great visuals, varied enemy design, and your passengers reframe the traditional survival horror dynamic, but these strengths alone cannot save the game from its polish and design issues. This is a game in serious need of a post-launch patch to at least address some of these problems. As it is though, the final station gets a 4.5 out of 10. Sometimes a Sith Lord is the right person for the job. Star Wars Month continues with explosions and ridiculous boss battles in LucasArts' final major in-house game. This is The Force Unleashed.
I'm waking up to ash and dust. I wipe my brow and I sweat my rust. I'm breathing in the chemicals.
For those who don't know, what is Fathom?
Oh, am I to answer that one? Well, I'll start. It's a action RTS that's set underwater. That's kind of the one-liner. But there's a lot going on in the game. I would say if, you're into Descent, that's kind of one of our inspirations. So it's got that kind of 6 degrees of freedom motion and tries to tie in some RTS elements, with like base building and unit building and even a little bit of unit commanding. So, it's just meant to be kind of a hybrid. We tried to boil it down, so it was...
This is Epistory, Typing Chronicles.